Okay, hi everyone. My name is Honor Feedy. I'm with NAESP and we'd like to welcome you here for our the Wallace Foundation session. We are so pleased this morning to have Dr. Stephanie Jones with Harvard University. Stephanie's going to be talking to us about social emotional learning, right? From the inside out. So Stephanie, welcome to our session.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. I am really delighted to be here, even if virtually. It is a little odd to be looking at the screen and imagining all of you in the room, and I can't see you at all. So I just see myself right here. So, but as we all have over the last several years, this is just another thing that we have to cope with. So I am really happy that we can use this technology to come together like this. And again, I am delighted to share this report with you, which is basically the topic of my presentation, is to really just go through this Navigating SEL from the Inside Out report on social and emotional learning. And I'm just going to go through these 4 areas. The first is really giving you an introduction. I'll start with a little information about social emotional learning. I'll give you an introduction to the report itself. I'll talk a bit about our methods. So how did we create this thing, and what are the tools that we used, and what can you expect to see inside the report itself in terms of summary charts and profiles and worksheets. And then I will talk a bit about how to use the report, how it can be used for any particular goals related to social and emotional learning that you have. I'll touch here on a couple of new elements to this report since its last edition. So this is the second edition of this Navigating SEL from the Inside Out report, focused on elementary school, pre-K through grade 5. The first one came out in 2017. This one we released on the website last summer, I believe. And overall, this report has had a great deal of interest from those in the field. I think on average, it is downloaded about 3,500 times a month. Most of those into my computer. Just kidding. So it seems to be offering some information that people want to use. So just getting into the introduction, I always start with a kind of level set on what is social and emotional learning. There's a great deal of conversation in all kinds of ways about this topic right now, and I have found that it's useful to really describe what it really is and how it is relevant to and situated in education. And so I'll just start by asking you all who are quite familiar with these kinds of scenes to put yourselves inside the head of the learner. And it could be a young child in a classroom with an educator, and they are reading that story and they're thinking about the words and their connection to the picture or the ideas and their connection to the actual words they're seeing. They're listening to that teacher and trying to understand what's going on in that story. You could also imagine an educator and some students who are sitting in a classroom and they are doing something like algebra. That is an everyday learning task in many schools. Here are some kids working together in the science class. They're doing a science experiment. They're collaborating on it. Here is another version of that, which is an educator and some students who are dissecting a frog. They are learning about the biology of that frog, which is for some alarming, for some really interesting and exciting, and so on. And then you might further imagine a classroom of adults who are engaged in professional development, professional learning, or who are collaborating on or planning some kind of initiative tied to the school. All of these are learning settings that take place in or touch schools and schooling in some way. And if you just imagine what those learners have to do to really deeply engage in whatever that task is, they need to focus their thinking. Their attention needs to be on the task at hand. It's the frog, the beaker, the teacher explaining something that's in that textbook, or the children who are trying to make a connection between the words they're hearing and the words on the page. They really need to focus their attention. They need to manage their behavior. So all of these settings require some level of control of behavior. So you're not bumping into someone next to you. So you are being respectful of those who are sitting around you. So you are turning your head and listening to those who are speaking. All of that is basic management of one's own physical behavior. In each of these cases, there are positive relationships, or positive relationships facilitate learning. So it could be peer-to-peer. It could be the feeling of trust that young children have in that adult educator, or the feeling that any of these people have that they belong and are welcome in that learning setting, and that it is those relationships with others that make for that sense of, I belong here, I am noticed here, I am part of this work. And then, of course, all the way through it, understanding and dealing with feelings. So feelings arise in all of these settings, and they are good feelings, they might be challenging feelings, but they're happening, and we have to sort of understand them and do something with them so they do not distract from the task at hand, or we can use them to engage more deeply in the task at hand. So emotions are a big part of the learning enterprise. So that's basically social emotional learning. Those are the core skills that really make learning happen. They're a foundation for it in classrooms, in schools, but also outside of classrooms in all the settings where human beings learn and grow and interact. So as all of you, I am sure, are aware that those kinds of skills, that set of skills, are really talked about in many, many different ways. And every once in a while, I get on Google and I Google the phrase social and emotional learning just to see how many hits are there. And it has just grown dramatically. So I think right now we're at about 600 million different things come up. And those might all be about the word social and emotional learning, but they are also very likely to be about other things, like the kinds of things you see on this slide. So in our work, in order to sort of manage this plethora of ways of talking about and thinking about social and emotional learning, we have distilled the evidence, the way folks talk about it in practice, the way frameworks define the skills, into kind of core set of ideas. And the reason that I'm going into this in such detail is to both explain the kinds of things that went into our guide, but also sort of expand the boundaries and how we think about social and emotional learning, because there are actually quite a bit of academic disciplines, disciplines that organize practice in different settings that really bring to us lots of different ways of thinking about social and emotional learning. And so here are the sort of set of skills and competencies, the specific ones that we really focus on in the guide, and that I would say are that represent the kind of boundaries of the literature that contribute to our understanding of them. So here's some kids, adults. And of course we have, because we're talking about schools, we have the kind of academic domains, which are many. There are many different things that fit into that circle. Relevant to social and emotional learning is, of course, a cognitive domain. So how we think about and focus our attention and so on. I'll go into the details about each of these in a moment. An emotion domain, a social domain, a domain that represents sort of beliefs about oneself and identity, character, so guideposts for behavior and belief systems and values, and then, of course, personality, sort of dispositions and ways of being. And these are all here because there is academic literature and a lot of practice-based interest in ideas across this spectrum. So to define them just a little, of course, we all know these academic disciplines. This is hardly an exhaustive list, but things like these. In the cognitive domain, we have things like managing and shifting attention, controlling impulses, planning. So for older kids, planning, goal setting, critical thinking, these are all part of this big umbrella, but often forgotten. An emotion domain, which includes things like emotion knowledge and expression, emotion and behavioral regulation, and then more sophisticated things like empathy, which demand some of those simpler skills like recognizing and understanding emotions. A social domain, which includes things like understanding and reading the social environment. So reading those social cues, the kinds of visual and facial cues, emotional cues that come without words, that are not verbal. Social perspective taking, so like leaping into the head of another and understanding their view or the sort of social scene that's happening among a group. Basic pro-social and positive behavior. Conflict resolution, so managing conflicts with peers and having solutions to them, and social problem solving. In the identity domain, we have things like self-efficacy, growth mindset. We hear a lot about mindset these days. This is where this goes. Agency, so having a feeling of sort of action and a role in things and being self-directed. Self-esteem, self-knowledge, knowing oneself, understanding one's beliefs and purpose. In this category of character and values, we have things like ethical performance, intellectual and civic values. So those guideposts that and norms that we hold that drive into our behavior. And then personality, which comes out of personality psychology and has been written about a great deal. Things like optimism, so sort of ways of being and dispositions, gratitude, openness, enthusiasm, and so on. And so when you look at the literature about social and emotional learning, all of these different things come up. And I would say maybe earlier in my career, I said, gosh, this is really hard to navigate. And I feel like we need to get to one view. And I've changed that position over time because I think that these ideas represent so well such a wide contribution of thinking about what's important and what's valued in different places by different people that we really have to have a big tent on this field in order to do the work well. So in order to help folks navigate that big tent, we generated a set of tools on these two websites to really distill and connect and kind of make transparent the big frameworks that define the field. And the one at the top we designed and released maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it includes many, many frameworks that organize social emotional learning skills that represent those big domains I just described, and has tools for connecting them to each other. So those who are doing work in this area and are curious about different frameworks or thinking about adopting a framework to guide their practice work, their policy work, their research, whatever, can see how the terms and the ideas in different frameworks are connected to each other and what is meant by different terms in different frameworks. And so that's the first one on this list. And then the second, we just released a month ago, and it actually adds frameworks that come from around the world. So it adds to the number of frameworks that are coded and included on the site. And it includes a bunch of tools for determining what framework makes sense for any particular group of stakeholders, and how, like, a set of supports for deciding what to focus on and to build consensus in a particular community around the work. And so those are all just publicly available, and I would point you to them to explore. They're really fun to click around on, but the tools are really actually quite helpful in sort of building a group of stakeholders, bringing them together around this kind of work. Happy to answer questions about these more later. So now turning to the actual guide, my sort of big backdrop on social and emotional learning, and now we turn to the guide. And as I mentioned before, this is the second edition of this preschool and elementary school guide. In fact, it is the second edition of the elementary school guide, but we added to this one preschool. So we added to the number of programs in the guide, we recoded everything, and we added preschool. And in general, we defined our task in building the guide as we wanted to build a really practical resource for those doing this work in schools, preschools, and out of school time settings. And we included in it 33 programs that really represent what is used most often out in the field. And we design lots of tools and supports for making decisions and kind of navigating this big area. And I'm going to go through the whole thing right now. So we know that social emotional learning programs implemented in preschools and schools make a difference for the outcomes that we care about. And there are lots of studies. There are meta-analyses, which are studies of studies that tell us this is the case. That is great. It's been super useful to have that really quite rigorous and substantial evidence base. What we don't really know, on the other hand, is like if we went inside those programs, what would we see? What are the components included? What do they really focus on? Because different programs emphasize different things, and they do it in different ways. And so we thought we really need something that is hyper detailed, that allows anybody who wants to do this kind of work in schools or in out-of-school time settings to make really clear and informed decisions based on knowledge about what's in the program, but also bringing to it knowledge of what is needed in their setting. So we designed this report. I should mention that for those of you who are interested, we are just in the final stages of a version of this for middle school and high school that will be released, I hope, later this summer, and so that will also be available. So the goals of the guide are really to provide information to the field about the kinds of skills that are targeted and the strategies, the instructional approaches that are used most often, to highlight things that are unique and different about the different programs, and to highlight things that are shared among them, to build a set of tools that allows anybody who wants to do this kind of work to navigate and use this information as kind of data to help drive decision making, and then offer recommendations in a number of areas. How do I align the work that's happening in my school with what might be happening in the out-of-school programs that are tied to my school or that are in the community where the kids who go to this school spend their time in the afternoons, and to bring in information about important aligned areas, equity and educational equity, and trauma-informed work in schools. And those are two new areas. So for those of you who might be familiar with the prior version of the guide, those are the kind of new chapters we brought into this work. So how did we do all of this? We created a process for turning program materials into data that we could distill and summarize. And that meant identifying programs that would be included in our analysis. It meant designing a coding system and coding the programs according to sort of different skills that we viewed the activities as targeting and the instructional methods used. Collecting additional data on the different kinds of components that go along with the program, and then turning that all into a guide by analyzing the data. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of those parts. The coding system was designed to capture really three things for each program: the curricular content and focus, which included a detailed coding of lessons. So imagine a team of coders. We have purchased or acquired each of the 33 programs, and they have them in front of them. They have a system they have been trained with, and they are reading every single activity in every single unit in these grades, so non-adjacent grades, so that to reduce the burden on the coders, but also make sure we were really capturing the sort of breadth of information across the grades. So they read every single activity and made a couple of judgments about each one. So what are the specific SEL skills that are targeted by this activity? And what are the instructional methods that are used in this activity? So it's quite fine-grained. We also, as I mentioned, coded additional program features. So we included information about the kinds of things that go beyond those core lessons that are inside of the scope and sequence. So these are things like, are there tools for engaging with families? Are there ways offered to integrate this social emotional learning work into academic sort of more traditional and standard academic instruction? Are there supports for addressing things at other levels like school climate and culture and so on? And then for this information, we went kind of beyond the curriculum itself and used the materials that were available from the developers that were online or that they shared directly with us. And then we went through and gathered every bit of information we could about any evidence or research standing behind the program itself. So these are studies, these are white papers, these are reports. So any kind of thing that helped us understand what level of evidence has been generated about that particular program. So we gathered all that information and then in the guide distilled those program effects. So for anybody who's interested in a particular program, they have quick access, not just to the studies that have been published about that program, but to a summary of the effects themselves. So that resulted in these key elements of the report. So we include in the report an analysis of those skills and competencies that are targeted, the instructional methods used, the additional program components, and those find their way in the guide into a set of program-specific snapshots. So if anybody is interested in a particular program, they have this like distilled body of information, like a little book itself about the program, not a book, but like a bunch of pages. In-depth program profiles. So the snapshot is the summary and the profile is this bunch of pages. A set of tools that allow one to look across the programs and sort of make judgments about what to focus on or what's interesting and different and the same between them, and then a set of planning tools. So we highlighted skills that are targeted, instructional methods that are used, additional program components that are offered, and when and where programs are similar and different. That's the basic information that's included in this report. So the programs in this guide includes these. Those that are in bold include pre-K lessons as part of the program, and those that are in italics, which is relatively few, really focus are designed for out-of-school time specifically. So for those of you who are interested in that, you can look directly at those programs. Many people ask us how we decided what to include, and we use these kinds of inclusion criteria. I should say there are many more programs out in the world that focus on social and emotional learning. Some have, some are curricular and some really aren't. And so we tried to emphasize those that were really well suited to the kind of work we were doing, which meant that they had program materials that we could read and code. So they were relevant to the project. They include these kinds of lessons and specific activities that we could read and try and understand. We tried to represent a kind of diversity of focus and approach in order to capture the different kinds of things that are out there and available for those who are working in schools. And of course, we had to be able to access the program materials, and in some cases that required signing a non-disclosure agreement or something that, or a memorandum of understanding that said that we will not take out anything that is proprietary, that we will be really careful with the materials and not share them. So accessibility of program materials doesn't necessarily mean that all of these programs are publicly available. You have to, in some cases, many cases, purchase them. And then there is some evidence, some kind of research that stands behind them. So getting into the coding system a little bit and thinking about like, what are the skills that are targeted by the program in particular? Our coding system includes 6 SEL domains, and inside or across those 6 domains are 23 specific skills. Our coding system comes right out of the many decades of research in educational psychology, human development, neuroscience, and so on that is relevant to this body of skills. So we feel like it's a pretty good system that captures the boundaries of the social and emotional learning field that I described before. So these 6 areas, even though they have different words, map on to those 6 areas that I described before. So, and here they are. There's a cognitive domain, an emotion domain, a social domain, a kind of character and values domain, a perspectives domain, which is what we call personality in our coding system, and that identity domain. And there are 23 skills, specific skills defined in our coding system that allow our coders basically to read the activity and say, is this activity targeting something like emotion knowledge? Is it teaching children, young children, elementary age children to understand different emotion words, to build their emotion vocabulary, to support them to understand the kinds of expressions that come from others that represent different emotions? So that's the kind of question that a coder is asking when they're reading an activity and using this coding system. I just use the emotion knowledge and expression code or subdomain as a specific example. So inside of each of these are further descriptors of what this particular skill means and looks like. I think I'm 99% sure that the entire coding system in detail is at the back of the guide. Turning to instructional methods, we included here in our coding system about 21 different kind of instructional modalities, and this has increased over time as we've read more programs and seen that there are more ways of doing this work. I'm sure as we continue to work on this guide over many years, this will increase over time. So, and these are the kinds of things that are in there. And those that are really the most frequently coded are things like discussion, having discussions about different skills or about different ideas relevant to this field is very common. No surprise. This is one primary vehicle for instruction, which is a really talking about something together. That goes along with lots of other things. The other high ones that are often used are the use of sort of visual displays and stuff that happens in the setting that's put up on the walls and around that can be referred to in an everyday kind of teachable moment way. Another is, my animations are doing weird things. Another is kind of direct teaching. So one of the key components of effective practice in social and emotional learning is really teaching about skills. And so that is a common feature of many of these programs. In terms of program components, there are 11 different possible program components that are included. One that is really quite frequent, that is there nearly every time, is tools for engaging families. Again, the animation is not working, but basically these are strategies and practices that are defined in the program that allow anybody using it to think about how does this program connect with families. And is that the kind of set of tools and strategies that is going to work in my setting? And then we get asked a lot, especially over the last couple of years, is do these programs include information on equity and inclusive education? And what does that look like? And does it align with the research on equity in education? And so we spent a fair amount of time with this guide addressing this topic and really closely looking at all the programs to see how much this kind of work is included. And we included chapters in this guide on this topic. And actually, I can make available for anybody who's interested. We've written a separate whole paper on that. So part 3, getting inside the report. I'll just show you what some of these things look like. I'm going to focus on these 2 chapters, but overall, the report includes a chapter on social emotional skills and interventions. It really just summarizes most of what I described at the beginning of this session. It describes how all of this work is really relevant to out-of-school time settings. What are the ways that in-school and out-of-school time programming can align and kind of build on each other and support each other. As I mentioned, we included a chapter on achieving equitable SEL. Sort of what is equitable SEL? How is that defined? And what are some strategies for doing that work? The 4th chapter is the same thing, but focused on a trauma-sensitive approach to SEL. Of course, all of these areas overlap in many ways. And then chapter 5 includes a set of comparison tables, so not evaluative, like this program is better or does this better than the other. It's more like this one really emphasizes this, while this one emphasizes this. If you're interested in the first thing, you might want to think about adopting this program and so on. It's really just very basic, neutral comparisons among them. And then chapter 6, as I mentioned, are these kind of detailed program profiles. So if you're really interested in one program and you want to look there, you can jump right to it and just spend your time there. So chapters 5 and 6, which I'm going to highlight right now, include many of these kind of practical products. Chapter 5 has summary tables, which allow anybody to look across programs. You can focus on skills if you're really in your setting, noticing that children are struggling in one particular area and you want to adopt a program or components of a program that really emphasize that area. You could use this table to identify one or two programs that focus in areas that are of interest to you, or programs that really cover all of them evenly. Table 2 focuses on these instructional methods, and it can be used to identify the ways the programs do the work and think about, does this really fit in the way that we do instructional work or the kinds of things that we really want to emphasize here. And then table 3 covers these additional components. Chapter 6 includes the program profiles, which have program snapshots, which are the summaries, and then these really in-depth profiles. I'll give you a sense of each of these next. So here's one of the tables that comes in the guide that compares the programs to each other in terms of their relative emphasis in these different skill areas. And so you can see in those bolded columns, there's one that says cognitive, it's in red. There's one going over to the right that says emotion, it's highlighted in yellow. Going further over to the right, there's one that says social, and so on. Those are each of those big domains. And then the little columns next to it are each of those subdomains. And the shading, so the shading of these colors describes its relative emphasis relative to the other programs in that particular area. The darker the shading, the more emphasis. The lighter, the less emphasis. So if you look here at the social column, these two programs really emphasize this social domain relative to the other programs in this guide. And those are Caring Schools Community and the Good Behavior Game. And moreover, in the social domain, they really focus on pro-social and cooperative behavior. So if you're really focused on that particular domain, you've noticed that the children in your grade or in your setting are really needing support in this area, those two programs might be something that you consider. Overall, these latter categories, the sort of character and values, the perspective / personality and identity, are areas that they're emphasized less overall. It's not really a surprise because we're focused on social and emotional learning programs, but they really are in there to some degree. And so if you're focused on something like mindset, which falls in that identity category, you might want to start with this column and say, okay, I know it's not included all the time, but mindset is something that we really want to incorporate along with our SEL work. And so I'm going to see which programs really focus there, something like Girls on the Run or Al's Pals, and then I'm going to see what else it covers, and does that also meet my needs? There are lots of different ways to use this information. Again, another table like this, we call these actually heat maps, so they give you really a sense of that relative emphasis, the heat in each of the cells. And this one is focused on instructional methods. As I mentioned before, discussion is really common, like it is used in all the programs as a kind of core instructional method, but it comes along with a lot of others. And so if you're in a setting and you really want to couple social emotional learning work with high quality children's literature and an emphasis on reading and literacy, you might think about these programs, which have a really heavy use of books and stories as a way to do social emotional learning instruction. And that in this case is 4Rs and character first and competent kids carrying communities and so on. So you can look through each of those instructional methods, which are described in detail in the report, like there's text about each one explaining it. This might be a way to further narrow one's search for a program. And then finally, these are the components of each program. Okay, let me just see where I am. I mentioned that we have been trying to provide information about the degree to which these different social emotional learning programs sort of address issues of equity and inclusion. And we created a sort of preliminary coding system that allows us to do that. And we provided information about the degree to which the different programs really address questions of equity and inclusion. Here's another, just an example, which is these are the different programs that really provide lots of resources about supporting climate and culture in the setting, along with all of that other instruction in social and emotional learning. So turning to the program profiles, for each program, there is a snapshot, which is that summary. That's what it looks like. It has key information drawn from across the whole profile. We include detailed information about effectiveness. So not only do we say what are the studies, we say what did they what did they find in a kind of summary form, which can be helpful. We do for each program a summary of its particular focus in those skill areas. So this one again is the 4Rs, which has a relatively high emphasis in that social domain, but covers kind of the other things also. We provide detailed information about those sub-skills. So you remember there's 6 domains and 23 skill areas. So in this set of pages, we include information about all of those sub-skills inside each domain in the form of a pie chart. We provide each program's own heat map. So this one you can see along the left-hand side, it shows the different grades that are coded, and the units across each grade are also on that left-hand side. And then there's a heat map that shows relative emphasis on these skill areas for those grades and across those units. So this kind of thing can be overwhelming for some, but it also can be useful if you're thinking about how am I going to line up my instructional work in the year with the particular emphasis in this social emotional learning program across the year. So there are ways to think about how can I roll out these units so that they line up with other instructional work and modalities that we are focused on here. And this heat map can be a kind of roadmap to figuring that out. We also provide a tool that describes those key instructional methods. We summarize the program components, and then we have a page that basically describes how this program stands out relative to the other programs. Like, what does it emphasize relative to the other programs? And then we provide information about how to access that particular program. So turning to the last session or section on using the report. In our view, this report, which is free and available online, hyperlinked, so it's easy to navigate. It's actually quite long. You might not want to print it out. It's about 550 pages, but you can really use it dynamically online. There are lots of ways, so it can be used for many purposes. We see 3 primary ways, but there are, as I said, absolutely others. It can be used to select specific programs or strategies that meet a particular SEL goal or need, so in a skill area, that align with specific outcomes that are relevant in that setting or tied to funding or other kinds of guidelines that are happening in that place, that align with or complement other initiatives that are happening, instructional initiatives or otherwise. The guide can be used to support planning and goal setting conversations among a key set of stakeholders. We've provided a bunch of worksheets that can be used to do that. And then it can also be used to sort of take stock of what's already happening. Like, is the program that we're currently using really doing the things that we imagined it would? Is it currently meeting our needs? And so on. So we included a whole bunch of tools to support these kinds of activities, and they take the form of these worksheets. They're all in the guide and hyperlinked. You can print them out and use them in any way that suits you. Identify specific SEL priorities. There's a worksheet about that, considering how to consider and notice and take stock of constraints or opportunities that are already in the setting, and then how to use the information in those summary tables to identify programs or approaches that align with those two things. So I'm going to just turn to the supports that are included in this guide for making connections to out-of-school time, for thinking about how equity plays in, and trauma. So Chapter 2 focuses, as I mentioned, on how to think about coordinating and or adapting for out-of-school time settings. And we write about this in the chapter. We provide a number of visuals that support this. It's really a set of principles or considerations for thinking about how to select SEL programs specifically that could be used in out-of-school time, or adapting existing ones to best meet those needs. And it rests on these core ideas, which is that many of the skills that are really focused on in out-of-school time settings are also the central goals of social and emotional learning programs, which are to build a safe and positive environment, to enable children and youth to have high quality relationships with adults that are kind of activities, of course, that are developmentally appropriate and relevant and deeply engaging for kids, and that provide opportunities for direct skill building. So a lot of what's happening in out-of-school time, as many of you certainly know, is really very similar to what SEL programs are intending to offer. So thinking about these particular considerations, we think, is really important when trying to make sure that in-school work and out-of-school time work is not either redundant or contradictory or anything that would undermine the effectiveness of any particular approach in any particular setting. So we want programs to be consistent with each other so that the messages and the supports are similar for children who are experiencing them in both places, but we wouldn't want them to be redundant, which reduces engagement and sort of buy-in from those who are doing the work, that are, of course, aligned with the mission of both settings, that align with the kind of pedagogical priorities of each setting, and that take into account student needs. So the skills aligned, thinking about these important considerations will help the work across the settings be more effective. Sorry, I went backwards. And once a particular place has considered each of these components, then the guide can be used to identify the appropriate SEL approach for those settings. One thing that we know from a vast amount of research is that children really do better. They acquire the skills, they have more opportunities to practice when they can do it in the multiple places where they are learning. And that's in the classroom. So inside of schools, that's of course in the classroom, but it's also in the hallway. It's out in the playground or the play yard. It's in the lunchroom. It's in the gym and the library and so on. But it's also after school and before school and in the community. So to the degree that we can really align these efforts, we will do better by children. So turning to Chapter 3, we focused here on questions of equity and sort of defining what equitable SEL might look like. We went through the literature and the many different areas that kind of intersect with SEL or could, and we generated this definition that's consistent with others that we saw in the literature, and I'll just read it out. Equitable SEL, in our view, affirms diverse identities, incorporates student cultural values, practices, and assets, so the things that everybody brings with them, everyone brings with them, fosters positive identity development, promotes student agency and voice, and acknowledges issues of bias, power, and inequality, and works to address them. So the equity chapter itself, now I'm over on the right side of this slide, provides the following. So if you're interested in this topic, this is where you can go and this is what you'll see. It highlights the sort of places where concepts of educational equity align with social emotional learning. It defines equitable SEL. It includes a set of recommendations for achieving it, should that be something a setting wants to do. And it describes the extent to which the SEL programs included in this report support this thing we're calling equitable SEL. A couple of recommendations that are in the chapter, I'll just highlight them for you. It all begins with adults. Of course, everything we do really begins with the grown-ups. So investing in adults' knowledge and skills and self-awareness. Designing and adapting SEL curricula to reflect what students are bringing with them, so their backgrounds and identities, and that's true for everybody in the setting. Being inclusive and intentional when thinking about what kind of programming is going to be in the school, and that means including what students are thinking, what families are thinking, and communities are thinking, and what staff is thinking. So that stakeholder group should be broad. And then accompanying and aligning SEL program and thinking about the way other structures in the school align. So this is like discipline practices and structures, and of course trauma sensitive systems. So how do those practices line up? Are they consistent with the SEL work and the messages that we're sharing through that work? Turning to the final component, which is a trauma sensitive approach to SEL, which is chapter 4. We define trauma informed SEL. This comes from Transforming Education. You'll find a definition like this or similar to it in lots of different places. Trauma-informed SEL creates a safe and reliable environment where students who have experienced adversities and trauma feel supported, are welcome to explore their strengths and identities, exercise their agency, can develop meaningful and positive relationships with adults and peers, and have access to the mental health supports they need. So in the chapter, we describe basically what the science tells us about the impact of trauma exposure, stress on social and emotional development. We talk about the alignment between the broad goals of basic SEL work and trauma-informed practice, and we offer a set of recommendations, which are these. Again, as I said before, it's really about supporting adults and preparing educators for what they might see from children who are exposed to chronic stress and trauma. So that, of course, demands that we really think about educators' own trauma exposure, their own experiences of stress, and really supporting their own well-being and stability. And then thinking about how to educate everyone in the setting on the signs and symptoms of trauma. So everybody in the setting is ready and able, has the knowledge they need to support kids. One thing to remember is that social emotional learning as an enterprise is kind of a universal approach. It's not intended to be a standalone only approach to trauma and shouldn't be considered a trauma intervention. It's really just one piece in a host of possible supports that can address children's needs in this area. So that's all. I think we have about 12 minutes for any questions you have. You can always, of course, email me. Here's my email address, and we have a website about our lab and the other work that we do. So thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to address any questions.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Great presentation. For all of you, if you want to download this presentation, you can go to your app and call up this session, and the slides will be there. Also, there is an evaluation form. We'd love to have you fill that out. But in the meantime, are there any questions? Would anyone like to ask? Yeah, sure. Run around and give you the mic.
Hi, Stephanie. I know you can't see me. My name is Ryan Glaze. We actually have a mutual friend. I'm working on my doctorate at University of Oklahoma, and I'm sure Dan would want to say hello if he was. I do have a question. This is such a politicized topic now, as I'm sure you're aware. And I know in our district, there's kind of a reluctancy to investigate a program to use universally. And so what they've tried to do is just embed some of these components in the practices of teaching, but I don't feel like there's a framework that's really guiding that in a way that's equitable. And so this is more of a practitioner question, but I wonder if literature or maybe your experience maybe would help guide some conversations that might, open the idea to exploring some programs instead of just trying to say, well, we're going to do these things intrinsically or embedded in our work.
Right. Great question. And great to come out right at the start and address some of what I think is really complicated politics of this right now. So I appreciate you asking that. I guess I have 2 or 3 responses. The first is that I think it's just, in part, it's about some of the messaging tied to what social emotional learning work is. And the way I've been talking about it over the last year is slightly different from how I talked about it before because of these issues. And I've tried hard to emphasize something that I think I didn't emphasize enough before, which is that these core skills are really foundational to learning, that they're part of it, and that we can't kind of walk away from that. And so I think in some places it can be helpful to kind of step back and say, let's remind ourselves what this is all about for us in a learning setting. These are the kinds of things that we as educators and as parents tend to agree children need to be successful. They need to focus their attention. They need to manage their behavior. They need to feel good about themselves in school and be ready to actively engage. And they have emotions, and that's something that we need to address and foster, right? Because it supports excitement is something that could support learning. So I'm trying hard to reframe how we talk about it. And I think that one of the challenges, now getting to the second point, is in the field is that we do one of the challenges and opportunities, I'll say it that way. So we do have a lot of wonderful programs. They've been tested, they work, they are really carefully crafted, but they don't always fit in every setting. And there's lots of implementation challenges, whether they are political and ideological, or they are just about not having enough time to fit it in to the kind of the arc of the classroom day. And so in the ESEL lab, we have been thinking on the kind of practical side about how we can use the data we generated from all of these programs to identify, and then in an intentional way, create a strategy-based approach to social emotional learning, which sounds like what might be happening in some of those settings in Oklahoma. We're trying to ground that strategy-based approach in evidence-based programs, so to pull out the common elements and then redesign them and make them basically on cards so they're very simple to do and very simple to see as integrated into regular academic instructional work, but not ad hoc. So with a lot of sort of care in their design and support around sort of how to weave them into the everyday work in a school. So I'm not totally, I think a strategy-based approach can be really productive because it meets a lot of challenges to SEL, whether they are political or ideological or other. So, but it takes some care. I think that, I guess this is the third, say, another thing that I see is that there's kind of reframing of SEL in other terms, which is sort of, we sometimes hear, actually we use this terminology in our lab sometimes, which is skills for learning and life skills. Like all of that stuff is very similar to kind of the more traditional SEL work. And it could be that reframing what this whole body of work is to emphasize those foundational components of it that are tied to learning could be helpful. I have no idea if I answered your question at all, but those are my thoughts.
He's shaking his head yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm happy to talk about the strategy-based approach more. This is something we call SEL kernels, and you can see a description of it on our site. There are a bunch of them that are publicly available. You can download and see what they are like.
So thank you, Stephanie, so much. Any parting thoughts for our principals?
Thank you for all of the work that you do. It's so important. I can't say it enough. And I imagine it's very hard. So, so thank you. That's what I would say.
Okay. Thank you all.